So first, big three upgrade. Big three upgrade. What would you consider to be the big three and the advantages of that, and specifically how it applies to if you're using a high output alternator?
So we provide really good color instruction sheets with every alternator that we sell, and it's basically our instruction sheet says use a properly sized wire, which is either going to be 2 gauge or 1/0, depending on if it's a 240 or a 400 amp unit, somewhere in there. 2 gauge is sufficient for 240 amp. 1/0 is sufficient for 400. And you just run it directly from the alternator to the terminals of the battery. Positive, run a ground cable dedicated and a positive cable dedicated from the alternator to the terminals of the battery. That handles our end of it. That prevents the alternator from burning up. Now, if the customer is grounding their amplifier to the body, unibody, amplifier. No, I'm talking about it in the rear of the vehicle. If someone's grounding their amplifier or batteries, if they have supplemental batteries in the back of the vehicle, and they have to ground that amplifier, to the frame rail, they don't want to run a cable all the way up front, then that's where the big three comes in. Then you would have to run an additional ground cable, 0 gauge, from the negative terminal of the battery to the front, unibody or frame, if the vehicle has a frame. It's a truck.
Right, so increased ground size, alternator output, and then you did say it correctly, the actual terminals itself, guys, go directly to the battery terminals. There is a lot of power distribution close to the battery. Maybe it's a red plastic box that has the cable. Well, this is connected to the positive post. Do not run your alternator output to that tiny little box because it's connected to the battery. Run the alternator output directly to the battery positive post.
That's exactly, I should have mentioned that. That's exactly right.
I just wanted to underline it. You did say terminal, but I just wanted to underline that fact because I've seen that. I was an installer for many years, and I had stuff rolled into the shop looking like that. And then a wire gauge for amplifier output. I think you did say. You said for your say it again. The wire gauge for amperage.
2 gauge will suffice for a 15-foot distance. That's from front to back essentially for 240 amp alternators. If you're a 370 or 400, you want to run 1/0. And of course now, here's something else I want to touch on that nobody ever talks about, is running these adapter billet terminal blocks.
Oh yeah.
Tony knows about this. He's got one in his drawer.
We've seen a lot more of that lately.
People, they like, that's it right there. People like running four. That's a goes on the back. The people will put that on the back of an alternator stud and run 4 0 gauge cables off of that. If you can imagine the weight, and the strain on that stud, it's totally unnecessary. I mean, a single 0 gauge pure copper cable would work fine, but people want it to look pretty. It's kind of a
social media
bragging point.
It's an Instagram, look at all these 9,000 runs of cable running off of everything to everything, from everything to everything. And you can't really have too much cable per se. It's not going to hurt anything electrically speaking, but the weight you have, based on that output stud of that alternator, if you have 4 pounds of cable hanging off that thing with no strain reliefs, over time it will vibrate, work the stud loose, and cause an alternator failure.
And then on that note, it's probably more difficult to get a tight connection, period.
Yeah.
Versus just having a ring terminal with a stud on it with 0 gauge, or that beast. It's going to be a lot more.
Well, it's got more leverage.
Well, and also think about that huge, massive, uninsulated chunk of metal. If anything touches it, you're going to have a fireworks show.
Yeah, there's no way to fuse it, that's for sure.
Yeah. So it's just, people will fuse them. They do run fuses. Usually it's way far away. While we're talking about fusing, this is another big question we have all the time. You do not have to fuse the alternator, really. You have to fuse the battery. When people ask, if you buy a brand new Chevy truck, for example, it doesn't have any circuit protection in the alternator charge cable. It's just a short cable from the alternator to the battery, and that's it. Just like from the battery to the starter. There's no circuit protection in that either. people ask if they want to fuse things, do I need to fuse the alternator? Well, you can if you'd like. If you do, put it as close to the battery as possible, because you're really not fusing. If you short an alternator out to ground, it just shuts off. It's just done. It does nothing. The battery is what you need to fuse. If you
Right.
short a battery to ground, you're going to burn the car down. So that's an important thing to note too while we're talking about fusing.